Hello, everyone, and welcome to the January 2024 UCLA Tarjan Center Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Jasper Estebillo, Director of Training for the Tarjan Center, and it's my pleasure to be here with you all today. Before we get started, a couple reminders. We do offer live Spanish interpretation, and you can click on the interpretation button on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar and select Spanish for interpretation. Please also enter your questions for our speaker into the Q&A function throughout the talk, and we'll facilitate discussion at the end of the presentation. After today's lecture, please be sure to complete our evaluation survey to provide feedback and suggestions for future lectures. The link to the evaluation survey will be sent in the chat today, as well as in a follow-up email tomorrow. And with that, I will introduce our wonderful speaker for today. Dr. Ben Schwartzman is a research assistant professor in the Department of Special Education at Vanderbilt University and is the principal investigator for the Tennessee Employment Pathways Project. Dr. Schwartzman specializes in helping transition-aged individuals with IDD and their families navigate the process for connecting to paid employment. He's currently working with Tennessee's Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, or DIDD, to create an employment-first accreditation program for training job coaches and community provider agencies, and B, develop a curriculum for community provider agencies to use to train and hire peer mentors with IDD. Prior to his work at Vanderbilt, as faculty member at Foothill College, Dr. Schwartzman led the Tools for Transition and Work program, which is a community college program for young adults with IDD. Dr. Schwartzman received his PhD from UCLA, where he specialized in interventions for youth and young adults with autism. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Ben Schwartzman.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction, Jasper, and really excited to share our work with you all today. So today I'm going to be sharing our 5-year intervention development project that focused on assisting families in navigating the process of connecting their adult family members with intellectual and developmental disabilities to paid employment. This project is part of a rehabilitation research and training center led by Dr. Paul Wayman at Virginia Commonwealth University, and it's funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. So that's abbreviated into NIDILRR, which is NIDLR. And just to fill in some of the points, Jasper touched on a few of these already, but just wanted to give a brief introduction about my background. So I first got involved in this field as an undergrad at UC Santa Barbara, where I worked at the Cagle Autism Center. Then I completed my PhD under Dr. Jeff Wood and Dr. Connie Castry here at UCLA. Then following the completion of my doctorate, I led 2 regional center funded programs at Hope Services in the Bay Area for transition-aged youth and adults with IDD. And from there, I became a faculty at Foothill College, which is a community college in Northern California, where I led a transition program for neurodiverse students called Tools for Transition and Work. And the goal of that program was to help students decide if they'd like to transition from high school to finding paid employment or if they'd like to matriculate into the community college. My wife and I then moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where I got the opportunity to work at Vanderbilt University under Dr. Eric Carter on a variety of projects related to transition from high school to employment. And on a personal note, and the reason why I got involved in this work in the first place is due to my experience of having a brother with autism. My brother Joey has UCLA connections as well. He was in the inaugural class of the UCLA Pathway program. He's now 37. He lives in an apartment with a friend that he met through the Pathway program. He drives and he has had a fairly extensive work history since graduating that program. So Joey's experiences navigating the transition from high school to employment are still ongoing. And here are a few of the experiences he's collected over the years. So after Pathway, he worked at Office Depot, helping customers and as a cashier. From there, he worked for a few years at a recycling center in Santa Monica, but that recycling center ended up closing down. He then worked with Rosie's Foundation in Culver City for a few years, which was sometimes paid and sometimes volunteer. Then as a dishwasher for 3 years at a home for the elderly in West LA, but got tired of washing dishes every day for 3 years and then got connected through Rosie's Foundation again to a paid internship at a startup fiber internet company in Culver City called Ting. But unfortunately, that was a 6-month paid internship, which ended last year. And then since then, he's been volunteering at a synagogue in West Los Angeles, and he's currently looking for another paid job opportunity. And I share that because unfortunately, when looking at the literature on paid employment outcomes for folks with IDD, Joey's winding path of different work experiences is fairly typical and maybe even above average, going back and forth between entry-level jobs and unpaid experiences. And this brings us to our main question in conducting our research. What guidance do families need as they support their family members with IDD in navigating this often winding pathway involved with connecting to paid employment? So today I'll be covering how we attempted to answer this question for families in Tennessee and create a program that would hopefully get families the support they needed. We'll start off with an overview of the project, then I'll discuss our first phase of the project, which involved conducting focus groups with families, which led to our second phase, which was a pilot study. Then our third phase of the project, we expanded the pilot to a randomized controlled trial. And we also have a video of testimonials from families who participated in the RCT, which we're excited to share with you. And then we'll end with next steps of where we plan to go with this work in the next 5 years. So starting off with our project overview, let's take a look at Tennessee's employment landscape and what we set out to do in our work with families. So another project at Vanderbilt conducted the Tennessee Disability Services Study, which surveyed over 3,000 Tennesseans on a variety of items. And for this particular item, how important is finding or keeping a job? 88% of individuals with disabilities and 86% of parents responded that they viewed employment as an important aspect of their lives. However, when we asked that same set of people who rated employment as important, if they know who could help them in this area, half of the individuals with disabilities who responded and about half of the parents were not familiar with programs or services to help them find or keep employment. When we take a look at the numbers in our state, 74% of all Tennesseans are employed and only 35% of adults with disabilities are employed, which creates an employment gap of around 39%. Unfortunately, that gap is even larger when we look specifically at employment for adults with IDD, with an employment rate estimated to be around 20%. So why is there such this big gap between values and outcome? And given what we know about the contribution of parents and supporting family members being among the most powerful factors on employment outcomes, we set out to design ways of delivering the support and information that would be beneficial to families. So our role as one of the 6 studies in the RRTC that I mentioned on IDD, led by VCU, was to develop an intervention that would provide families with the information and support they needed to navigate the processes involved with connecting their family members with IDD to paid employment. The goal of our RRTC is to increase employment outcomes, and our study specifically aimed to design supports for families through mentorship, combined with access to the information they need. And for the rest of this presentation, we'll go through each phase of our 5-year process in developing our intervention for families, from our qualitative study with 60 families in phase 1, which we used to develop and launch our pilot intervention in phase 2, which we then expanded and updated to our RCT with 58 families in phase 3, and phase 4, our next steps for packaging and disseminating our findings. So starting off with phase 1, in order to inform the development of our intervention and ensure that important components were addressed, we conducted focus groups and individual interviews with 60 parents and caregivers of adults with IDD who are either currently employed or who had recent paid work experience. Initially, the idea was for these focus groups to take place in person, but the pandemic made it necessary for us to conduct these interviews via Zoom. With everything families had going on at this time, we were grateful to have 60 families participate, and families gave us such rich answers that we had to split our findings into 3 separate journal publications. So we'll go through each of those. So first, we asked families a series of questions related to how they define and prioritize employment for their family members. Our paper on their answers to this question, titled "More Than a Paycheck: Parent Perspectives on Meaningful Work for Individuals with IDD," was published in the Journal of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and you can use the QR code below to access that paper. And just to show a sample quote, this is from a father of a 22-year-old son with autism. This was a sentiment that was shared by many parents that we interviewed. The more I've thought about it and talked to other people, a lot of the reasons we would want any family member to have employment apply to our son: sense of self, sense of identity, sense of accomplishment. We also asked families to share their perspectives about what barriers seem to be preventing their family members from successfully connecting to employment. Our paper on barriers to employment was published last year in the American Journal on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. We have a QR code down there as well if you'd like to take a look at that paper. And many parents described the difficulties they had with accessing information about how to navigate employment systems and supports. This quote showcases the feelings and frustrations many parents face. I'm a mama bear, and so a lot of what I've learned is trial and error, and hunting and pecking, and emailing, and I've spent an unbelievable amount of hours, and I still don't have all the answers. Families shared numerous barriers with us, which we coded into 6 categories that are depicted below in the pie chart. Individual skills and support needs, family needs, challenges with transition services provided by the school, adult disability service system challenges, workplace barriers, and community-related challenges such as job availability or perception of disability. For our intervention development, we focused on barriers impacting the family that we could attempt to lessen, such as families' lack of knowledge about employment support services, how to navigate Social Security benefits, families' concerns around safety, difficulty coordinating logistics like scheduling and transportation, and the lack of support that they had available to them. And lastly, we asked families for suggestions on what could help facilitate access to paid employment opportunities and overcome some of those barriers that they mentioned. And so this paper was just recently published in Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin, and the QR code is below if you'd like to access that paper. Families identified several components as essential to the employment process, which included family involvement, someone to provide assistance to families to guide them through this process, resources that could give them the information they need, counseling around the impact of employment on benefits such as Social Security, access to employment support services like job coaching, and connecting with other families of adults with IDD to learn from their experiences. So we set out to address each of these suggestions that families gave us in the development of our intervention for this project. And if research papers aren't really your thing, here's a more digestible way of reading through some of our main findings. We have a series of briefs available on the RRTC IDD website, and there's a QR code down below in the bottom left for that. And if I'm clicking too fast through the QR codes, I'll put those links in the chat during the Q&A. So based on what we learned from those 60 families in the focus groups and interviews, we conducted a 1-year pilot study with 4 families. And so we developed a support package consisting of information access, which seemed to be a key issue that parents brought up. So we provided parents with a practical guide to pursuing integrated employment. It had an overview of important employment topics, information about how to connect with local and national resources, and then some frequently asked questions were in this guide that we created. And then the second piece was support through mentorship. So ongoing support from a parent whose son or daughter was already working so that that parent can share their lived experience with the parent that's just starting out the process. And the idea is for the mentor to provide information and any strategies that work for them. And then also just being that motivational and accountability partner. So checking in, seeing how the job search is going and seeing how other pieces of maybe connecting to services are going as well. So just to describe a little bit more about the resources we provided to families, this is a quick look at what our practical guide looked like. We called this practical guide the Roadmap to Employment, and it consisted of important employment-related information, resources, and tips for families. So just taking a look at a few of the example sections here, they're split up by topic related to employment. So for example, this was our first section, and this was all about identifying interests and skills. So in each of these sections, we have recommended activities and worksheets for the parent to work on with their family member. We also have online and local resources, as well as national resources and ideas for families to check out. We also have some suggestions of who can help the family, maybe people that they want to add to their employment support team. And then, like I mentioned, section on frequently asked questions. And so we paired 4 families who had unemployed family members with intellectual disability with 4 families of employed family members, and we followed them for a year in our pilot. So families were told to meet monthly for mentoring sessions. This could have been in person, over the phone, or over Zoom. It was totally up to whatever worked best for each of the dyads and how they would like to meet. And this is a visual from our paper that was recently accepted for publication. So each of those dark closed circles refer to months where the dyads met and maybe formally connected. So not necessarily meeting in person, but maybe they talked over the phone or met over Zoom. And if there's no circle in that month, that means that they did not meet. And then the labels on the right of this chart refer to the phases of the employment process. So were they in the preparation phase, the planning phase, exploration? Did they apply? So the application phase, or were they able to find paid employment? So by looking at this chart, you could see that by the end of the year, 2 of the 4 families were able to find employment and successfully connect their family members to paid employment, while 2 families did not. And just to give a little bit of explanation about what happened with the other families. So the Smith family, they decided partway through that maybe volunteering in an unpaid position was a better fit for them for the time being with everything they had going on. And the Johnson family unfortunately had a family emergency come up and they could no longer prioritize searching for employment. But to take a little bit of a closer look at the Connor family and their experience participating in our program, this is a description of the parents that were matched to one another. So both parents were of similar ages. So we called the job seeker as the person who, a parent of the person that was currently unemployed. So I was a 53-year-old white mother, and we paired her with a mentor, a 56-year-old Black mother. Both were married with additional siblings, and they both lived in an urban area, so lived in similar locations. And then the parent of the job seeker, they were hoping to get some insight around developing their support team, identifying local businesses to contact, and then figuring out what supports and accommodations her son needed. And then the mentor was very strong. She had a great knowledge of the supports and service systems available in the area. And she was really great about thinking creatively about what types of employers and types of jobs to maybe reach out to, and then problem solving any of the issues that came up. And just to share some information about each of their sons, job seeker was 21-year-old male. He had intellectual disability and autism, and his daily support needs indicated he needed some support, while the employed adult, 25-year-old male with autism, needed a little support in his daily support needs. And they both happened to have, in this, we didn't plan this, but they both happened to have an interest in cars. And so the employed adult, he worked at Advanced Auto Parts, and the job seeker was hoping to find a job related to cars. So just a quote from the Connor family early on in the program about participating in the pilot. The steps for employment for my son began when I first started speaking with my mentor. She included her story and the steps she's taken, including pitfalls. We utilized information supplied with our Roadmap to Employment guide, and it helped us start on the correct path. And here's a picture of her son in his work gear. So he was able to find employment 5 months into the process through personal connections and networks. So his brother actually worked at a car dealer in the area, and his brother spoke to his manager about creating a position for Connor, and that's how he was able to find a job. So he was hired as a porter assistant at the car dealership. His job was stocking the refreshment bar, wiping down tables, maintaining the showroom floor and stations. His favorite part of his job was having his personalized name tag that had the logo on it and everything. And he really enjoyed interacting with customers. Was his favorite part of the job. And here's what the mother had to say about having that parent mentor throughout the employment process. My mentor has been wonderful, and I know if I have a question, she will find the answer. She helps encourage me on next steps and keep organized. She's great to work with, and I feel I've gained a friend. And so in looking at some of those successes and some of the families maybe that didn't work out through the employment process, we wanted to gather a better understanding of how these mentorships around employment could work on a larger scale. So we updated and expanded our interventions statewide, and we conducted a randomized control trial. We referred to this phase of our project as the Tennessee Employment Pathways Project when we were advertising to community providers statewide. So we made a few updates to our two main components of information access and family support. We added what we called a short course, which was over Zoom and consisted of 4 weekly Zoom classes for families to attend as a starting point at the very beginning of the project. This was kind of in reaction to some feedback from families where we gave them the roadmap to employment, but we wanted to have a little bit more of an interactive approach to talking them through the roadmap and walking them through some of the important steps of the employment process. And we wanted to make sure all families that participate in the project got access to that information. We also created what we called an employment planning tool, which was a hands-on worksheet for families to work through. So it really was a summary of the roadmap. Each of the sections of the employment planning tool covered each of the sections of the roadmap, as well as each of those 4 weekly Zoom classes. So families got completing that employment planning tool as a homework assignment during the short course. We also updated the roadmap to employment with new information and programs. And as you all know, if you're in this field, things change so much from year to year. We realize this will probably be an ongoing process of continually updating our roadmap to employment. So even in 1 year, some of our information and resources got a little bit out of date. And for family support, we developed a formula of matching criteria for how to pair mentors with job-seeking families. So going from just pairing 4 families to pairing 29 families, we needed to come up with some sort of a matching criteria and formula to do that. So we decided to also additionally check in with families every other month instead of checking in every month. That seemed to be a little too much in the pilot, and we wanted to give families a little space and allow them to work on things for a couple months before we checked in every so often. So just taking a closer look at the short course and what we covered in that for families at the beginning of the project, we thought that all families, no matter the intervention condition, should have access to the roadmap, as well as interactive discussions around the main components of the information that's covered. So that short course was 4 75-minute classes that we hosted over Zoom for families to attend. And this course covered types of employment options available, so part-time, full-time, how to take a person-centered approach to employment and including family members in each step of the employment process, how to match their family members' skills and interests to ideas for jobs that they can pursue. We also covered types of supports available to families, which included formal supports like job coaching, customized employment, vocational rehabilitation services, and our state DD waiver program, and then other supports outside of the disability service system like American Job Centers. And then we also talked about how to connect with local agencies and providers of those services in their communities and what the family's role should consist of in that process of communicating and connecting with employers during the job search. So just a little more information about our employment planning tool. That roadmap, like I mentioned, was quite extensive. It was about 80 pages long. So we developed a worksheet for families to sit with their family member to complete, and it summarized each of those main components of the information in the roadmap. And we encouraged families to work through particular sections that corresponded with what we covered each week in the short course. And sections of the tool included identifying strengths and interests, thinking about previous work experiences, creating employment goals, creating a transportation plan, and scheduling, identifying support needs both in the job search and on the job, their personal connections and any networks they might have to potential jobs in their communities, and then creating a plan for where they needed to start first to begin this process. And just to talk a little bit about eligibility and who we included in the project. So now that families were more familiar with how to use Zoom during the pandemic, we were actually able to expand our project statewide. We initially were going to go just locally around Vanderbilt. The idea was going to be meeting in person, but families seemed to prefer to meet over Zoom. So we were able to expand to the entire state. So for families to participate as job seekers, they had to have a family member, or they had to be a family member of an adult with IDD, which we defined as either a diagnosis of autism or intellectual disability. And that family member had to be 18 or older. Job seeker families were notified that they could potentially be randomly selected to connect with a mentor monthly for 1 year. So they had to agree to be willing to do that if they were selected. And for mentors, it was all the same eligibility criteria, except that they were family members of adults who were already employed, and that they would be willing to connect monthly with a job seeker family for 1 year. So job seekers and mentors also agreed to participating in check-ins with our Vanderbilt team every other month for 1 year. And families were notified if they were not randomized to receive a mentor, that they would just receive check-ins from some of the members of our Vanderbilt team. So in our recruitment process, we cast a very wide net where we could, anywhere we could think of, where we could find people, transition fairs, school districts, teachers, provider agencies, state departments. We talked to special needs ministries and different communities of faith, social groups, posted a lot on social media and Facebook, different clubs, recreation groups. So from all of our posting all over the state, we received 159 interest forms from families. And from those interested families, 66 were determined to meet our eligibility criteria. We happened to get a lot of interest from out of state that we unfortunately had to decline. We also had a lot of families of teens with IDD who were not quite 18 yet, and families of those with disabilities outside of IDD that we unfortunately cannot include for this particular project. And so from those 66, we had 9 families drop prior to randomization for a variety of things, usually busy schedules or family emergencies or other health-related issues. So 58 families were randomized, 29 intervention and 29 comparison. And then for the mentors, we received 43 interest forms from folks that wanted to learn more about being mentors for another family. From those, 25 were determined to be eligible. 3 job seekers decided they did not need a mentor after all, because they, after the short course, they felt like they had a good enough handle on things where they were able to immediately find a job, which was great. And so those mentors were rematched to other job seekers. And 1 mentor offered to work with 2 job seeker families. So that's why our mentor number doesn't quite match up with the 29 intervention job seekers. So just taking a look at a quick snapshot of some of the demographics of those who participated. So for family members, we mostly had mothers participate, but we had a few fathers, sisters, cousins, guardians, and we had 1 grandparent. And the average ages between the 2 groups were fairly similar. We had some diversity, but the majority of our participants in both groups were white. Participants' family members' disabilities were somewhat similar as well. So for the job seeker group, 35% had autism, 31% had autism and intellectual disability, 21% only intellectual disability, and 13% had a family member with Down syndrome. For mentors, 40% had a family member with autism, 8% autism and intellectual disability, 40% with only an intellectual disability diagnosis, and 12% with Down syndrome. And then a similar breakdown in sex of family members between the 2 groups. 35% of job seekers had a female family member with IDD compared to 32% of mentors. Average family member age was a bit older for mentor families, averaging around 26 years old compared to 23 and a half for job seekers. And then obviously the mentor families, they were all had family members that were employed, but the job seekers, interestingly, we had more than half who had previous employment experience, and then 43% had never been employed before. And like I mentioned, one of our updates to our expansion to the randomized control trial was taking a look at some of those mentor matching priorities. So we had 4 main priorities when creating our mentorship matches. First, we looked at job seeker characteristics, which, so for example, we might have matched families who both had daughters with autism, or they maybe were both similar ages. We also took location into consideration. So families were knowledgeable about specific resources in their local community. So for example, we matched Nashville families to one another, or we matched Knoxville or Memphis families to one another as best that we could. We also considered families' employment knowledge, if they had been previously employed or not, We did not match them with a mentor family of someone who maybe just got their first job. And then lastly, we considered what services families were enrolled in currently or interested in enrolling in. So if a mentor family was already receiving vocational rehabilitation services, maybe we would pair them with a family that was interested in learning more about that. So just to kind of summarize all of those components I just mentioned in one visual, so we could see how what comparison received compared to what intervention received. So all families completed a baseline survey and the short course prior to randomization, and all families received the same information from our team. So then they were randomized to either being paired with a mentor or not being paired with a mentor. In the first month, our Vanderbilt team scheduled orientations for the mentors to meet their job seeker partner family, and we led them through their roles and explained our vision for how the mentorship could go. Intervention families were then asked to meet with their mentor monthly. And like I mentioned for the pilot, this could be however they felt was best for them. So it could be a phone call, a Zoom call. A lot of families texted and emailed, or it could be meeting in person. And our Vanderbilt team checked in with comparison, intervention, and mentor families every other month just to see how things were going and see if there was any other support that we could provide along the way. At month 6, intervention families are asked to rate how their mentorship is going so far. And then at month 12, all families were asked to complete an end of project survey with similar questions as the baseline survey at the beginning of the project to see if anything changed in that year. Then please take these findings with many grains of salt, as we've only had our first 2 cohorts of families complete the year-long project so far. So we still have 44 families in progress. And we're happy to report that 16 out of the 29 intervention families, job seekers with IDD, they've successfully found paid jobs, while 9 out of 29 of the comparison families have successfully found paid jobs. So this is including those who are still in progress. So we have to see how those turn out at the end of the 12 months, but it's looking very promising so far. And we're actually really glad that a number of the comparison families have been successful as well. We did not want that number to be 0. But it's looking like, and again, very preliminary, but maybe that mentorship can give families a little extra boost in navigating this journey, but still to be determined with more of our data coming in. And we received great feedback from families on our short course. So 73% thought that our sessions gave them strategies that could easily be used. 77% believed that our information was relevant, and 82% would recommend the course to other families. And just here's a few quotes from families that they shared on our feedback surveys. It empowered the parents to come alongside their adult child in seeking employment. There are way more resources than I knew about. It was very helpful to get feedback and ideas from others. And so our work would be nothing without the input from our families, and we could never have developed an intervention without their voices and listening to their experiences. So we wanted to give them an opportunity to share their thoughts directly with you all on what it was like for them to participate in the Tennessee Employment Pathways Project. So I'll take a second and switch screens, show you a video clip from our participating families.
Really enjoyed the short courses with the families. You know, it just opened up so many resources for us. Just the information that was there, a plethora of links and resources and programs that I had no knowledge about. So I'm very thankful for that. And also to go through these courses with families, it just showed the human side of that and what other families deal with and their stories. And so there was a connection there. As parents of children with disabilities, and once they reach adulthood, we're kind of cast into an area that is unknown. So there are so many things that we don't learn or we are not told. And so this program has been really vital for me and for my job seeker in preparing for the future. So I think you guys have done an amazing job. breaking things down for us, providing the courses for us. Even so much as the binder that you gave us is so helpful for me that I still look back on. All the programs that have been shared with us, they've really made a huge change in my son's future as far as job seeking goes.
I am a parent advocate, and I have taken courses of advocacy, and I have been extremely involved with my child since she was diagnosed. So I feel that I know the system, I know the organizations, but I always wanted to get connected with the right programs that will help me learn more so I can help her. I think that being part of the program has been key, because even though you have knowledge and you think that you know it all, you always learn something. I was really pleased to get the binder with the lessons there, and then our homework while I was in the program, because it held me accountable, kept me focused in what I needed to do to help my daughter. Definitely I learned about resources that I didn't know before. Talking to the other members that had similar situations in their household also always is nice to feel that you are not alone. And we are all have the opportunity to learn together and come together and express our accomplishments, successes, and also failures and frustrations. I do appreciate that this program check on us on a continuous basis. So where are you? How are you doing? Or, what have you accomplished since the last time that we met? It made me rethink of where we are, and I have to always go back to the book if I needed to. Am I doing everything? Recheck if I am doing everything. It's been great. I mean, I really appreciate all the support.
We did keep to checking in on schedule every month. Even if we texted or talked in between, our boys are on the autism spectrum. And so you have a connection there already, a shared language, and being able to start at that place was really great. We would talk about the employment, but I'd say the other half of our mentoring sessions were those, hey, what do you know that's new? Hey, what do you know that's new? The idea is there is this holistic approach for the surrounding of a self-advocate. And so employment is one of those places. So if you can know this little tidbit here, or that little tidbit here, or try this in other lanes besides employment, it can only improve their situation.
So we have had several meetings because we talk on a monthly basis, and she has been amazing. She is so knowledgeable and has really helped me brainstorm with any problems and any bumps in the road that we've faced in the employment seeking process. She's really helped pull other ways of making it happen pretty much. And I really enjoy talking with her. Once you go through it, you have wisdom to share, and she's really, really helped me.
We mostly stuck to once a month meetings on Zoom that generally went maybe 45 minutes to an hour. We did meet once at the end for coffee to kind of celebrate the end and the success that we had. I think that only another family really in this position can really understand the importance of finding a workplace where our young adult is safe and valued and happy. Of course, it feels great to be helpful to someone, especially when you know how difficult it is to put together all the pieces for successful employment, and when you know what that family is going through. And I would say, though, in our case anyway, it wasn't just the feeling of helping out another family, but the mentee in my case was also very knowledgeable herself, and she provided me with a great deal of information also on services and different contacts for different things. So we ended up helping each other in many ways. Every month it was something that she would have or that I would have that the other person like had no awareness of. This process is so difficult and, you know, emotionally draining, and why having another family to talk to who understands, you know, the ups and downs of this is so important.
So he is working 1 to 2 days a week at Vanderbilt Medical Center. And he got into the car and said, "Mom, I had my year evaluation and they told me I was doing fantastic, that my coworkers like me, I'm thorough, I don't make mistakes in what I'm doing, and they're just so glad to have me." And I mean, he was just beaming from ear to ear. He is viewed as someone that is important to this job and that he's done a really good job. And there's nothing that a parent will ever trade to have a kid be able to come and say those kinds of things. Is really empowering.
My daughter graduated and she was working in Kroger, remember? But then during the summer we have a problem and she did not work over the summer, and now she's in this transition program. She is being exposed to other job sites, but I have more knowledge to make a better decision with her later on about what she really wants.
So because of this program, we found a job at a ice cream shop. We live in a very rural area, and that's one of the downsides for us is there aren't jobs, you know, a lot of times. And so we've really had to search, and this job is about 45 minutes out of town, but we're willing to, you know, to take that and go with it.
Those that are considering, however the grant world works, I don't know, but those that are considering, it's worth it. The fact that you are looking at a population that 95% of the time, they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. Now I'm going to get emotional. They want to be a part of a working employed situation where they feel that they are important and they bring value and worth. That's my hope.
I think I really, you know, praise you all for doing this. I think the work is so, so important. You cannot have a full life without work of some sort. And, you know, it's incredibly hard to get these young people employed and keep them employed. And so a project like this, I am really thrilled to be a part of, because I know how important it is, and I'm very, very, you know, happy that you all thought this through and made this effort, and it's just so worthwhile.
And so with those powerful words from families, we are motivated to continue to expand and refine this project. And so just wanted to share with our last few minutes here what we're up to now and what we're preparing to do in the future. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we've either published or are working on publishing our findings from this project. So we have 3 papers on our qualitative interview study of 60 families from phase 1. And like I mentioned, the last of those 3 papers was just accepted in Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin. For phase 2, our paper summarizing our pilot intervention was recently accepted in Journal of Vocational Rehabilitation. And for phase 3, we're just beginning to get our data together. We're working on a paper on our baseline data that we collected from families at the beginning of the project. And we'll publish our RCT findings as soon as everyone completes those end of the project surveys and finishes their 12 months participating in the project. So some future directions, we're planning to apply for additional funding this spring for a scale up of the intervention. So we're hoping for another 5 years of funding. And I see a couple of you in the Q&A asked, is this available in California? And actually our plan is to do that with our funding. We'd love to make this a national model. So our goal is to increase our numbers and identify what things we need to adapt to be effective nationwide. And currently I'm working remotely for Vanderbilt. My wife and I have moved back to Los Angeles this past summer. So we're planning to pilot the program here in California. And again, that's dependent on grant funding. So fingers crossed for that. We want to refine our mentorship structure. So as you saw in the pilot, and as you saw with some of our families in the randomized control trial, some of those mentorship dyads just took off and they met with each other every month, while others seem to need a little bit more support or maybe different support. So our goal is to create maybe more of a guide or a structure for the mentorship with some of those families who might need more support. So for example, when you meet in your first session together, work on these 3 things. In session 2, work on these 3 things. So we want to come up with a little bit more formalized structure for that mentorship. We also, we want this intervention to be scalable and sustainable so that community provider agencies maybe could deliver those short courses, and community provider agency participants, maybe they could match some of their agency participants with those who have already been employed and help create some of those mentorships. So we don't want this to just be conducted at universities. We want to make sure that this is getting into the community as well. And then lastly, we are really interested in looking at peer mentorship. So current research literature, there's very few interventions that have created mentorships between individuals with IDD. It's much more common for the mentor to maybe not have IDD and the mentee to have IDD, but we want to create mentorships just like we did between parents, but between individuals with that lived experience to be able to connect and talk about employment. And lastly, just wanted to thank everyone who contributed their efforts and work to this project. And we wouldn't have been able to do this without funding and support from NIDLR, as well as our colleagues from VCU and collaborators in the RRTC on IDD. And of course, we'd especially like to thank our devoted families and mentors for being so gracious with their time and their busy schedules to participate in our project for a year. So I'd love to take the rest of the time now to answer any questions that anyone might have. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Schwartzman, for sharing your important work with our audience. Clearly a lot of support from the audience, Q&A, and a lot of excitement for next steps. And we're really hopeful about hearing about ongoing work and expanding this project nationwide, hopefully soon. Reminder for our audience to continue typing your questions for Dr. Schwartzman into the Q&A. But I'll go ahead and kind of start us off. And so I'm curious in learning more about how you developed these materials, like the roadmap to employment and the short course. How did you and your team really kind of figure out what were the important resources to share and how to really condense it into, I heard a lot of the parents in those videos refer to the binder, but I'd like to know a little bit more about how that binder was created.
Yeah, so we had a number of our team members had previous experience being job coaches and running job coaching agencies. And so it really was a brainstorm of just anything related to employment. We also took any of those ideas and processes that we used in our past experience, and we looked at the literature as well to see what were some of those evidence-based practices and other employment interventions. And then we also, like we mentioned, for this intervention, we listened to families and heard what families wanted and information they needed. So it was a lot of different pieces that came together in putting that roadmap together. So yeah, we're really excited with how it turned out. And like I mentioned, it's going to need some updating almost every year, or maybe even more than that. So excited to make that adapt to nationwide and other states as well.
I think that a lot of not just our audience, but broadly the families that we work with are going to be so interested in just learning how to support their family members who have different intellectual and developmental disabilities. I'd also like to learn a little bit more about the parent mentor role, how you identified these families, and it seems like there was such a support for the families in the intervention group. But can you tell me, Dr. Schwartzman, how more about the parent mentor role and how you identified those family members?
Yeah, we initially started out through personal networks of finding people that we knew that already had jobs. And we actually, this was, we did not really see it coming, being so hard to track down people who are already employed. But really through a lot of the community provider agencies, once people get jobs, they're kind of, their cases are closed, or they kind of move on. And so it's really hard to find parents of employed adults that through the community providers and agencies. So that's something we'd love to continue developing through relationships with community providers, of keeping track of what maybe alumni or closed cases are up to. And so we had some of those personal connections with providers developed already in Tennessee. And so those were some of our go-tos. And then we were already connected to a lot of different parent groups. And then there's a number of inclusive higher education programs in Tennessee, like the Pathway program at UCLA, that we were connected to and knew a number of people that were employed through that program. And then Project Search as well was a great resource in Tennessee for connecting to folks who had already been through that program. But that was probably we thought that would be a lot easier than it ended up being, of finding parents were more than willing to help. It was just finding them was the challenge.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And I think that anyone who is in this field or works with families really knows the value of partnering with the community, and especially in supporting individuals with disabilities. A couple questions I'm going into our chat. One clarifying question about the definition for employment was this, including 14C, segregated, and our group employment. What was that definition for employment, since that was our primary outcome here?
Yes, really good question. And I feel bad I forgot to include that, but we counted employment as competitive integrated employment. So no segregated or group employment. It was a job just like anybody else might have a job.
So important. Thank you for clarifying. Especially since we have lots of resources and things that we are strong advocates for competitive integrative employment. Another question here, and I'll define some of these acronyms too, since there's so many acronyms in this field. But one of the audience members is curious if families found DB 101, which is Disability Benefits 101, which is through California, helpful in navigating or understanding the benefits and work incentives, or if they needed WIPA, which is Work Incentives, Planning, and Assistance, which is available for individuals who are Social Security beneficiaries. But any additional information, Dr. Schwartzman, on DB 101 or WIPA?
Yeah, so we had our own, Tennessee has their own benefits to work is what it's called in Tennessee. So we definitely would give that to parents as a first stop of in the process. And that was very helpful. And one thing that we learned in working with them, another group that we're very closely connected with, is we went to them and we said, what's kind of a blanket thing we can tell all of our parent participants? Like, what are some rules of thumb? And their one thing they said was contact us. Yeah. Everyone is an individual case. You cannot give a blanket rule for all the parents that are going to be in your program. And so they really just said they are more than happy to, like, please call our number. Here's our email. Every person has their own individual pieces we need to look at, be able to figure out the formula for how much that work might pull from the Social Security check or other benefits. So they said, please send them our way. We would like to talk to all the families in your project. So we convey that to families.
Great. This next question, I think, is very important and always part of the conversation working with individuals with disabilities, but wondering about finding supports for behavioral challenges while in the workplace setting. I think that that's always a concern, even from being in the school, but now into the workplace. Any suggestions or ideas in terms of behavioral supports for individuals who are able to obtain employment, or paid internships or volunteer opportunities?
Yeah, I think what we called it in our project was the support team or the employment support team. I think when you're considering multiple components of supports that someone has, they all should be communicating with one another. And especially if there's behavioral issues going on, there's a lot of pieces that maybe they're working on with an ABA staff or some other behavioral support staff that will definitely apply in the workplace. And that person should be talking to the job coach, or in some cases, we had one family in our study whose ABA support was their job coach because that person also had background in employment support. So I think making sure everyone, including the employer, is on the same page. You might want to have a shared Google document of maybe there's visual reminders or some self-management cues, or maybe an app that the individual uses that they find helpful. Any type of information that each of those professionals can share with one another is helpful along the way. I know that's not a specific where to go for resources answer, but since I'm more familiar with the Tennessee system than with California's system for behavioral supports, it's just important to make sure all those people are communicating with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question here is, we've had previous lectures from other presenters on, individualized transition plans and talking about that transition into post-secondary education for many of our individuals at younger and younger ages. But any thoughts, Dr. Schwartzman, or advice on starting this conversation early, or what families can do to make sure that they are, really setting their family member up for success in obtaining competitive integrative employment?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple things. So the first that occurs to me is, and you may have covered this in other presentations as well, but so much of the entire special education process is about what the student can't do or how they can't reach certain levels of performance or where they're falling behind compared to peers. And I think the earlier we start identifying strengths and skills and kind of honing those strengths and skills and focusing on some of the positives really contributes to what that person can do later in life and their self-awareness of their skills and what their support needs are. So I think starting that from an early age of identifying what things might come in handy employment wise, and maybe what things are just hobbies or interests, and figuring that out early. And then a second piece too is something that really helped my brother was getting some opportunities for independence early in life. So he went to a sleepaway camp when he was, I think, 10 or 11 is when he started. And it was a special program with additional support for campers with disabilities. And I think in sending him to that program, my parents had no idea how that was going to go. And but kind of taking that leap of faith and giving him a shot, he really had that opportunity to have to kind of develop some of those skills on his own. And even if people or my parents didn't quite think maybe he wasn't ready, he became ready by giving it a shot. And that definitely didn't mean it went smoothly, but learning from those things. And I think the concept of dignity of risk comes up, where we got to give people the opportunity to learn from some of those experiences. So that's something that was really helpful for my brother, and I try to advocate for families to find some of those opportunities for independence.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important reminder as we're kind of wrapping things up, is to respect individuals' dignity and to really acknowledge that the notion of meaningful employment or a meaningful life is based on what the individual with the intellectual developmental disability chooses. Right? And so pursuing what they want and what's based on their own strengths, because what I might conceptualize as meaningful might be very different from other people. And I think that that's such an important note for us to wrap things up on. I'm noticing time here, and I know that we have so many other questions that we were unfortunately not able to get to, so I apologize for that. But any last minute or kind of last takeaways, things for us to look out for your ongoing work, Dr. Schwartzman, before we let our audience go for the rest of the afternoon?
Yeah, and like I mentioned, we're really excited about potentially expanding to California. And so we're going to put our application in this spring, and happy to reach back out to anybody who's interested in learning more if as soon as we find out if we get that funding or not, when we'll be starting. And I'll put my email in the chat if anybody wants to email me any of those unanswered questions that we didn't have time to get to.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Schwartzman. To our audience, if you are on our mailing list, you will get a follow-up email informing you when the presentation slides and the recording for Dr. Schwartzman's talk will be available on our website. And please stay tuned since we have a working relationship already with Dr. Schwartzman. All of us have our fingers crossed that funding moves forward and we're able to expand this program into California. And so as soon as you guys, or as soon as Dr. Schwartzman here, I'm sure that the Tarjan Center will also be involved and we'll be happy to help move this project forward. But thank you again, Dr. Schwartzman, for being here and for sharing about your work, very important, as well as sharing a little bit about your brother, Joey. I think we're all cheering him on too and hopeful for
Yes.
exciting next steps for him. Thank you to our audience for being here and as always being wonderful participants. We are looking forward to seeing you next month for our February lecture series. And last note to just complete our evaluation survey to give us some feedback and ideas for ongoing lectures. But thank you all for being here. Happy New Year. And we're looking forward to seeing you all for our upcoming lecture series. Goodbye, everyone.